everyone. Welcome to the copy editing demo. I am Laura Blackwell, and I'm going to be sharing my screen for this. I am also live on another window if you want to see a human face. And if it's confusing for you to listen to me narrating as I'm showing you something, you can also select CC in the lower left corner of the WebEx window, and that will show you my mumbles as I talk. Unfortunately, it might overlay the screen a little bit, so you're going to have to just figure that out. And unfortunately, I'm not always going to be directly facing the camera, so this may not be great for lip reading. But I wanted to tell you, thank you for being here. I love copy editing. It is one of the last stages of editing, usually the last one to make any changes at all to the text. It's a big responsibility, and it's a big opportunity for the editor and the writer both, all the editors and the writer, to make a better story or a better book. But it's also more than that. Language and culture reflect and shape one another, and they evolve together. If we are thoughtful in our use of language, we can make the reality we live in better. So as a copy editor, I try to make the language and the story get the author's intent through to the reader. And that's a lot more than adding and subtracting commas. There is standardization of spelling and grammar. That's very important because it removes distractions and lets readers concentrate on the story and on its meaning. And thinking about the author's intent and what the reader is perceiving makes me more reflective and deliberate. And through fact-checking and what contact and feedback I get from writers and other editors, I also learn a lot about the world and how our story is working. So I believe that copy editing helps me grow. So today I want to show you some of the basics of copy editing a short story and a novel, starting from the beginning of the process. I will stop for questions at the section breaks if there's time. If not, we'll catch up at the end and move to the Discord if we need to. If you do have a question, I would appreciate it if you would preface that with question in all caps so that I am likelier to see it, and I'm also likelier to see it in the Discord than I am to see it in the WebEx. So let's begin. The first thing that I was given is an early draft of a story of The Sweetness of Berries and Wine by Joe Miles. Joe was very kind to give this to me. This is rougher than the final form. If you want to see the final form, which I do recommend, it's in Future Science Fiction Digest. Let me nab that link and drop it for you if I can do that in the Discord. And if you'd like to follow along at some point, at any point, check how close things are, that's fine. Huge respect to Joe and the folks from Future Science Fiction Digest for this. If what I end up doing does not resemble the final form, that does not mean that the final form was wrong. Obviously, it's not. And I also happen to know that Joe writes very, very clean copy. So I had to ask them to drop in some errors for me to actually correct. So let's begin. This arrived to me in a somewhat unusual form because normally when I get it, it's double-spaced, it's full shun format. But I liked that this came to me single-spaced because it's going to let me show you a little faster how things are going with a little less scrolling. So the first thing I'm going to look at is special ordered. Hyphens are actually the hardest thing for us. It's actually harder than commas because Chicago, which is the guide I use, is a little vague about hyphens. There's a huge table and then there's this sort of general, if there's any doubt, leave it out rule. But special ordered makes sense here with the hyphen. This is how it's usually used, and I have looked it up before, and it's not in Webster's right now, so we're going to go with it. In general, if you have a house style guide, that overrules everything. If you have a dictionary, that overrules Chicago or whatever your style guide is. So, oh goodness, we've got some urgency going here in a small situation that could mean a lot to a person. Okay, so the setting is definitely science fiction, off-world. This, oh wow, this dialogue is just so familiar. Okay. Now here, I'm curious to know whether Shoshana actually is shifting the way she's sitting, or whether she's actually sitting down. And what I like to do in general is to leave queries in comments. I don't like to just change text unless it's something minor like a comma or an obvious typo, because the writer knows what they're doing. A they may have made a conscious decision to use it that way. And so I need to be aware that although, yes, I have experience with this, I have experience with the style guide, the author has more experience with this story than anybody else. So as authors, it's very easy to get upset. There's definitely a visceral reaction to corrections, but this isn't even a correction. I'm just asking, is it really sat down? Because I do think that would be a little bit clearer. Okay, now another thing that's interesting about this, and that I could tell from the working title, is that this is a Passover story. And this takes us into one of the biggest things about copy editing, which is making sure that you're respectful of the material. I do not have personal experience with with any Jewish customs. I have been to a Seder once as a guest, and it was lovely, but I don't know if it's all the same dishes and stuff. So what I might ask sometimes is I might ask the editor, because this is assigned to me by a developmental editor, what kind of research or background there is, if there's something that could be sensitive if we get it wrong. And that's a little awkward because I don't want to gatekeep or I police somebody's identity and who's allowed to write what story. But I do know that somebody who was raised Jewish or has a background researching Jewish culture things is going to have more experience and better experience with this than I will. And so I don't need to worry as much if my research conflicts with it. In this case, because I know Joe personally, I did ask about that, and Joe said that they did have some Jewish heritage, and they did some research and checked it with several people as well. And I know Joe and Joe's credible source, so that was not an awkward conversation to have. Sometimes it's a little bit sensitive, and but I just want to know because I want to know what I need to do, because I will do my own research, but I don't want to hypercorrect something. Hypercorrection is when you look at something that's right and make a correction that actually makes it wrong. So, oh, this is one of the mistakes that Joe put in. I asked specifically for homophone errors because I see a lot of them. Some people dictate into their computers, and some people, um, you know, catch on things like callous and callous. With an OUS, it's an adjective, and with a US, it's a noun, and just conflate them. Very easy to do. So thank you for putting that in for me. Oh, this is sweet. I'm going to do something that is not abnormal, which is just drop a little heart on that. When I'm finding something I connect with in a story, something I really admire, not every time, but at least a few of the times, I like to let the writer know because they just deserve to know what's working. And I, I I like for them to know that I'm there with them on the page, that I'm not just there to change their work. I'm there because I appreciate their work and want to help it get into the reader's brains in the right way. Adina stood staring at the ingredients on the table. I don't usually read aloud as I go. This is very awkward. Oh, the balance of sweetness and bitterness on her tongue. That's lovely. Oh, this is also lovely. And here we have a sweat heart, which is obviously a sweetheart. Thank you, Joe, for putting that in. And sometimes Word will flag errors, but sometimes it will flag things that it thinks are errors just because it doesn't know these words, or it thinks that it thinks that something is being used incorrectly. And sometimes you have to go check another source. When I say that Webster's the dictionary usually wins, that's only for specific words. It's not for instances of usage. And with this, like I think Charset is actually in mw.com. And you know what? It's actually not. But I know this word. I've seen this word before. I know that it's a beverage, I believe. And I'm not showing you me going to mw.com and Google because, gosh, you know how to do that. Oh, it looks like it's more like a chutney. Okay, my mistake. Good thing I looked that up. Okay, so she was looking for berries. Maybe that's why she can't make the charaset. And when I look at the web, charaset is a very common. The spelling of charaset or charaset probably is correct. So I'm going to leave that as it is. If Word will let me, I will go ahead and add it to my dictionary. But sometimes my Word gets surly and won't let me. Okay, no worries. And Tsimis, that is also a common spelling. I've seen different spellings of matzah, and if Joe chose this one, that's fine. But I'm just going to do a quick search and see if the other common spelling is in here, because then I would want to make them consistent. Wow, Nana's fun. Oh, this is so sweet. Haifa. I believe that that is a location on Earth. So yes, it is a city in Israel. So New Haifa with that spelling makes perfect sense. I don't pronounce Hebrew very well, so my apologies to those of you who are wincing. Okay, this is a lovely story, and I'm sorry I didn't get to show you a lot of copy editing because there's not actually a lot wrong with it. Probably got published in very similar form to this. Um, gosh, I mean, it doesn't need more dialogue tags. The spelling is good. It's what I would normally do at this point is just leave my note, close the document, and come back to it later. And the reason that I would come back to it later is that I always want to give everything a second read just in case there's something I missed. It's crucial to have fresh eyes the first time I read something. That's why I didn't look at this. I just pasted things at the beginning and ending to make this presentation a little easier. But there's really not a whole lot to do here. Good job, Joe. But when I do my second read, I would read usually from the bottom because it's an unnatural way to read it, and that makes things stand out to me. So if as I was enjoying the story, I missed the absence of an article where there should have been one, or a verb tense that wasn't right, or some little thing, then that will stick out to me more. I'm going to go peek at the Discord for questions. Okay, I don't see any questions. If you have any, go ahead and ping those at me. Otherwise, I am going to switch to showing you what a style sheet looks like. There's going to be a terrifying moment where I stop sharing and my screen will go black, and then I will start sharing again. Sometimes. Sometimes if the word is very obviously wrong. At one point in a manuscript, I saw exhume when I knew it was meant to be excavate. I will correct spellings and things like that. But often I will ask what's meant, or if I have a suggestion to make, I will say, this has a nuance of such and such. Consider a word like this instead, or consider rephrasing like this, because the author knows their business of how to write their story better than I do. I can point out some things that might be confusing to a reader, or might that up front from the client if they want me to do that. If I know someone's in an incredible rush or just really, really hates dealing with a lot of queries, I will sometimes say, edit assumes such and such. One thing I do relatively often is if you see the phrase his wife Barbara and there are no commas around it, I will put commas before and after Barbara, and sometimes put edit assumes only one wife, things like that. When doing the back, do I read by paragraph or sentence? I try to read by sentence when I can, because that copy editing a little bit cleaner. Sometimes I do read by paragraph if the paragraphs are, and usually when I send that back, that is part of the paper trail to the final document. It doesn't get, set next to another one in a grep file or anything. And I don't accept my own changes. That's just obnoxious. I think sometimes production editors do that when I send novels back to them before sending them to clients, because when you have 140,000 words, going through and checking comma by comma could really be an unkind thing to do to somebody. But I'm not as big a part of that with a text from Project Gutenberg. I know it's going to be pretty clean because it's already been edited, but it's old and it's UK. And UK spelling and grammar are not the same as American spelling and grammar. And one thing I am often asked to do is to sort of localize for the American market. So I went with the sign of the 4 by Arthur Conan Doyle, and we are just going to pretend that this is a new author who has one book out, A Study in Scarlet, and that this is the second in the series. And I think that's just in everything I do. I have to give the primary references so people can look it up if they need to and know where I'm coming from with it. I will go back sometimes and take these out. For instance, I'm not sure if I'm going to find any comma splices in here, but it is a very common thing, and I do leave them for voice whenever I can. So that's there in the basics. And same with the TKs in the manuscript. A TK is means to come. It's an old proofreader sign, and that's something we put in when we know that something is coming in, but we don't have it yet. And so there'll be like, I don't see it as much in fiction as I do in nonfiction, but I just want to be clear about what TKs have come from me and which ones have come from someone else. This is an unusual text because the chapters are numbered in Roman numerals and include titles, which is something that Chicago doesn't really have a lot to say about. And I personally like it because it adds to that late Victorian feel. And so instead of querying it, since it's not going against anything I've been told, I'm just putting it in the style sheet and saying that's the way we're doing it. And characters are presented in alphabetical order by first name usually. And you'll notice that although I have so far done only one chapter of The Sign of the Four, there are several characters, which is interesting because I think only 3 of them actually speak. And I put in whatever I need to identify them, whatever might trip somebody else up later. You know, if we say that someone has blue eyes, I'm going to put that in because if they have green eyes later, that could be an issue. I put in gender, although this is a late Victorian era piece, and I think we're unlikely to find anything but the binary. I try to do that for myself to keep myself aware of what's being presented, to avoid making assumptions. And you may notice as if you look at this that this doesn't sound exactly what we all know about Sherlock Holmes. I read this years ago. I deliberately did not reread it, but we all. And the locations. So far, there are not a lot of locations, and several of them are marked as mention only, which this one should be 2 actually, means that the action has not taken place there. And this is kind of overkill for a real world document. This would be a lot more important if it were a secondary world fantasy, but it is important to me because of the spelling of Trichinopoly, which is an old spelling. I looked that up and it's a place in India, and that is absolutely not the way that name is spelled anymore. So I put it there so that if that location, and it's also referred to only as a cheroot, kind of cigar, I believe it is. It's a tobacco product that you smoke. I know that. So that's why I wanted to make sure that we're clear about that. And special terms are where we get into things that aren't in the dictionary that we believe are correct, like bone being a wine, cork cutter is not a word that's in the dictionary, but it's very obvious from context that this is a person who cuts corks for a living. The case, I still don't really know what Lunka is exactly. It's definitely a tobacco product from my Googling. And I don't need to put the lowercase trichinopoly in here because it is in Webster's. And I also put in a summary. I did not put in all of the chapter titles as well. The first chapter, Science of Deduction, I wanted to, and it's really a an extremely introductory chapter. it's something that we don't see very often. It does not start with even with the current case. It basically just establishes that Holmes is a detective and what he believes is important, and also that he's doing cocaine because he's so bored because he doesn't have anything to think about, which is distressing to me as a reader, but it's part of the story and I'm just going to go with it. I'm not going to leave any comments for the writer about that. Watson is a doctor and is very frustrated with Holmes for doing this. And at the bottom, I do keep a timeline of events outside the book's events. Again, this is much more important for secondary fantasy, but it is still useful for things like this because it protects us from any inconsistencies. If the Riga case comes up again later, we need to remember when it happened, because if that kind of thing can throw a reader out if we're talking about something if we talk about something with the Riga case with something that could not have been present in 1857. Not every reader will catch it, but the ones who do will be very, very disappointed. Now, the novel, I'm going to go and see if there are any more questions in the Discord. I feel like I'm just shooting you through these. I see a few questions coming up. I am going to go ahead and stop my share, I think. Oh, that is a great question. The style sheet is for all of us. Someone asked who the style sheet is for. It is for the copy editor as I'm working, and it is also for the writer. I have talked to some writers about it, and they have received these from their editors, and that's great because it can become, if it's well done, a really useful reference for everybody later. And a series actually ends up with a series style sheet, which can be really, really long, but can help us keep away from problems like, I don't know, renaming a country in book 2 or whatever. I haven't seen that happen, but it could. It could. Very often with locations not often visited or characters who don't come up a lot, their names spelling changes. So, this might be similar to a world book. It's probably not as in-depth, but it should be useful. I like to think that the writers are going to find them useful later. So I am going to stop sharing this and get us over to the actual text of Sign of 4. The first chapter, The Science of Deduction. And you can see that Word is taking issue with a lot of things. Word is a useful tool for spelling and grammar, but not perfect. You're also seeing a lot of red here on the side, which means there are a lot of tracked changes. And the reason for that, I can show you in the review window, with the review window. When you see all markup, you see I didn't actually change that much. Most of it was just me taking out that hard return at the end. And I'm not going to do that on chapter 2 this time. I'll do it on a later pass because I just find that getting myself very focused on getting that return right means that it's easier to miss other things that may crop up in the sentences themselves. I did go through and make the chapters into headings, chapter titles into headings, just because it makes it easier for me to navigate the document. So this is not exactly as it would come from Project Gutenberg, but I am very grateful to Project Gutenberg. So I don't know if it's that interesting to look at chapter 1. There weren't a whole ton of changes. Let's look at chapter 2 and see what shows up. Okay, so this is Miss Mary Morstan, who was just announced by the landlady, Mrs. Hudson. Okay, so I'm already a little bit wondering because she's described as a young lady, which is a term that doesn't tell us a whole lot except that she's younger than the speaker and she's female, and that the narrator is trying to be nice about this person. If you look up lady in Webster's, it's quite an immense amount of nuance, but the phrase young lady actually isn't in there. I looked that up recently. And this is where I would not query anything, but I don't think it's the most useful term because it tells us more about Watson than it tells us about her. It might mean that she's an adult and young, or it might mean that she's actually a teenager. This is Victorian England and women don't have the vote yet, so I don't need to worry about my usual distinction about woman versus girl. If I see girl and someone's old enough to vote, I'm going to query that every time because that's a real issue. Weirdly, Chicago isn't on it so much, but AP, which is the style guide newspapers use, is very specific about it. And still a lot of newspapers fail. And that is a line that I find very problematic when it gets blurred. So young lady is something that makes me want to keep an eye on this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a paper note. Sometimes I make notes to myself on the document, but this is one that might tick the author off if they see it, if I neglect to take it out. So I'm just going to write down check age on Miss Morstan. Because if I do need to go back and gently suggest that perhaps this term is not the most useful, I will do that. Let's see. So there's also the question of whether blonde is still used as an adjective. Yeah, it's used as a variant for the adjective. Often you'll see it just as the noun, so that's okay. There's the question of whether well-gloved should be hyphenated. And so I'm going to go to my Bible, Chicago Manual of Style. Current edition is 17. And I actually used to have a bookmark in, yes, there it is, at the hyphenation table because, God, it's so annoying. So well is in this case an adverb and compounds according to parts of speech, adverb not ending in ly, plus participle or adjective. This would be hyphenated before but not after a noun. And I thought that's what it would be, but aren't you just glad that I did the extra work of double checking? Just in the most perfect taste. There was, however, a plainness and simplicity about her costume which bore with it a suggestion of limited means. Oh, I love that. Dress was somber. Going to take that out of the UK spelling. Gray. Oh. I personally do not like gray with an E in anything American. It is, but it does show up as less common spelling as its own entry, not as a variant under AY. So I am going to leave it. But when I see it, what I usually see is what I usually think is either they want us to think that this is English, which it is in this case, so it's fine, or they want us to think that they're Tolkien, which I see a lot. And I'm not crazy about it, but I generally have to leave it. Grayish beige. Mary Cassatt actually had a word grayish which was a gray beige. I wonder if that ever got into common usage. No, looks like not, which is sad because it's a great word. But I think Cassatt would be a little later than this anyway, so it wouldn't be appropriate. I do sometimes go to an etymology dictionary online just to see if the word that's being used is something that would be appropriate. For instance, if someone says, if this were secondary world fantasy and the dress was burgundy in color, I might suggest that we change it to wine color or something, because Burgundy is also a region of France, and if you have no France, having Burgundy doesn't seem quite right. You can also drive yourself nuts with this kind of thing, so some authors will just say, no, I'm keeping Burgundy, and I respect that. Untrimmed and unbraided. I guess unbraided? What does that mean? Probably not trimmed with braid? Because when we say unbraided, that's usually going to mean, I'm going to check in Webster's and see if they have something about that. But when we say unbraided, that's usually like unbraid someone's hair. So yeah, it's in Webster's, but it's in more the sense I'm talking about. It isn't decorated with braid. So I'm making a suggestion that makes it clear what I think he means. And the writer could look at that and say, oh, yeah, that's exactly what I mean, and just plop it in, and that's fine. Or he might say, yeah, that's what I mean, but that's not how I'd say it, and that's also fine. Or he might say, oh, shut up and ignore it, which is, also his prerogative, although I think in this case it might not be ideal for the reader. Let's see. Small turban. A suspicion of white feather in the side. I'm going to leave that. Because it does say that it's so little feather, it's almost ghostly, almost imperceptible. I like that. I'm going to tell him I like that. This may have even been a common way of expressing such a thing in the Victorian era, but I'm not sure. And this is also something I could use to be sneaky, but I'm more direct. By telling him what I think it means, if he means something completely different, he may need to change it now, or he may want to. Okay, her face head. Okay, I'm hoping that this person is an adult because he's describing her attractiveness. Goodness, Dr. Watson, do we really know about your experience of women? Which versus that? God, I hate which versus that. Webster's actually has a perfectly brilliant essay about this up at their site on which versus that. It turns out that at one time they were used interchangeably, and then someone decided, no, which has to be for very specific things, only when the sentence can't stand without it. Or when the sentence can stand without it, that only for when it can't. And it just, which usually gets a comma. This is kind of more of a UK usage. I'm going to change it to that. And kind of expect him to stead it, which means go put it back the way it was. My personal feeling is that which versus that should not be as big a deal as we have made it, but I'm not going to completely buck a style guide that I'm being paid to follow. I could not but observe that as she took the seat which Sherlock Holmes placed for her, that's odd. That might be correct in UK, might have been correct in UK in the Victorian era, but that's not something that's going to make a lot of sense. Generally, if you have to do a double take at it, it may not be what you want. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's great to make the reader slow down and do a double take at that sentence. Some writers are fantastic at this. Premi Mohammed is really great at doling the sentence out to you at exactly the rate she wants to take it in. And I love that. In nonfiction, I'm often told to take out passive voice, change everything to active, make everything go faster, eliminate wordiness. But in fiction, sometimes that's what you need to make it work for you. Sometimes that's what you need to help the ideas get into the reader's mind the right way. So I actually don't hate some of the things that some people will grumpily tell you are bad writing, because they're not necessarily. They can be useful tools. Okay. Oh, now he's got a nice point here that a lot of people forget, which is that in the olden days, and even when I got married 20 some years ago, I was told that you do not put a woman's name with Mrs. unless she is divorced, not even widowed, divorced. And I was told that it was very important because some older women would be very upset to be referred to by their given names on a wedding invitation, because it would make it look like maybe they weren't together or something. And it also meant that I had to refer to my in-laws as Dr. and Mrs. when I was saying that they were inviting, instead of by their names, which I like to think is a limit that we're battering down because it's really annoying. But this is very accurate to the time for a woman who is either married or widowed to go by her husband's name, Mrs. Cecil Forrester, rather than Amy Forrester or whatever her name is. I don't remember if that ever comes up. Let's see. So you can see that there's some things here that I would be adding to the style sheet if I felt like exposing you to me sharing and unsharing the screen, which is I would put in the physical description of Ms. Morstan, and I would also make reference to Mrs. Forrester and to her domestic complication in the events before the event of the book. Man, Holmes, I swear, he's not as, I don't think he's quite as obnoxious as he was in the show with Benedict Cumberbatch, but doesn't always think about how condescending he is. Oh, it was a big problem for her, not for me. Okay. Well, this is nice. He's excited now. And no clear cut always takes a hyphen, so I don't need to look that up. I'm wondering why Word is trying to make me Chekhawk-like, because I'm pretty sure that's right. But one of the things that's really helpful for a copy editor is humility, and that is just admitting that I do not know everything and I need to look up things from time to time. Okay, so this spelling without the hyphen is the preferred spelling in Webster's. There is a variant that takes a hyphen, and I will usually use first spelling in Webster's as my final. That is just sort of the best way to do it usually. Sometimes, like when I'm working for the Deadlands, I will take a listed but not top spelling as long as it's not marked as chiefly British or something like that, because I do have to keep American spelling, because the Deadlands is very, very, very intent on keeping authorial intent and voice. So, gosh, I mean, time flies. I need to check in and see if there are any questions in the Discord, and we're going to have to be wrapping up pretty soon. So go ahead and ask me questions if you have any. And I am going to put up a screen share that's just my contact information so that you can find me if you need to. I'm going to go hang out in the Discord for the keep after this so we can chat more. We're almost out of time. I'm also going to be at tonight's How to Get Started in Podcasting panel, and I have a reading on Sunday, which might be relevant to those of you doing the scavenger hunt. And I am pronounced Lahra, Lahra, on Twitter, Instagram, Mastodon Wandering Shop, and it's also my website. And you can sign up for my newsletter at my website, and I don't spam. So come say hi. I think I might be able to do one question. I don't see any questions per se yet, so I am going to let us just wrap things up, and you can come and ask questions in the keep afterwards, but I want to make sure that the people who need this space next get it. But I hope that you see a little bit about how the copy editor isn't just the scary person who changes all your commas and makes the writers you love cry on Twitter. We really are trying to protect not just the rules of the language, but authorial intent and what the reader needs. And I do believe that we can make not only work, but our world better by doing that. So thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate your being here. This has been lovely.